Hey, how's it going, guys? This is your boy Hazzed, and today we're going to be discussing a couple different things. One thing real quick, I got my 880 pants finally to drop out of Mythic and finally, and actually raised my item level up to 886 tonight, so pretty happy about that, pretty stoked. We're definitely starting to get up there. I want to break that 890 eye level, I want to get above that. But anyways, guys, also got to talk about two other things in this video. The first one being these 10% stamina nerf that's going to be incoming towards us in 7.1.5. Also, of course, I'm on the PTR at the moment. I'm going to be discussing the breath spec and discussing a couple questions you guys had and a couple concerns about it, and reiterating some of the things I lightly touched on in the video, but didn't really go into too much detail. So anyways, guys, let's jump into this. Now, your guys' main concern with the breath spec generally seems to be the longevity of DPS in single target. Now, I haven't shown you guys the actual breath spec to make more sense, and I'll go over it here for you. Now, basically, we're running as the level 56 talent Murderous Efficiency, which basically has a 65% chance to cause you to gain 1 rune. Of course, this enhances the breath spec, the longevity of breath, and of course, consistent damage. Now, the level 57 talent you're going to be running is Frozen Pulse, because that's going to increase the downtime of your DPS for PvE. Next, we're going to be using as the level 58 talent Avalanche, so you can increase your burst damage and of course increase your AoE consistency every time your 1 minute cooldown is up outside of breath. It works very well for the spec. As for the level 60 talent, I run Blinding Sleet. I mean, it doesn't really matter too much, but because I have a ring that procs extra haste, I go with that one to blind my targets. Otherwise, usually people run Winter is Coming to actually stun AoE mobs, things like that. I mean, in Heroics or Mythic Pluses, of course, run that. It's a nice little stun, and also if you have that ring, it will proc it. As for the level 75 talent, I like to use White Walker, so I actually use that 30% reduction on boss mechanics and things like that. Works quite well. Also for PvP, generally, it works really well for mitigating a lot of damage, and of course, it breaks you out of roots and stuff, so it really kites you away from your enemy, and you have a lot of time to get away from them. As for level 90 talents, this is where things actually get interesting. Because of the Gathering Storms buff, the 50% damage on that, it's going to make this a main spec talent. As for breadth versus consistency spec, you're going to be using, of course, Icy Talons. You're going to be rocking probably either Ice Cap or Avalanche. And of course, you're relying on Frozen Pulse and usually Runic Attune for more single target DPS and of course Obliteration. But as for the PTR changes, that enhancing damage to, of course, Gathering Storms actually makes this more consistent damage than Runic Attune. That's how big the buff is. And of course, they buffed it by 50% as a whole, which that is a lot of damage. And of course, we have a lot of talents that tend to ride off of this ability within, of course, our artifact traits. I believe it's down here under Frozen Soul. With all the targets that get hit, it increases that damage by an extra 100% for each target hit. So let's say we get 50% damage times 10%, or 10 targets, like that is insane damage stacking up. So that 50% is actually huge when it comes to the AoE and consistent game, Mythic Plus and or Raid setting. It doesn't really matter. It's crazy damage, and that amount of consistency actually changes over, of course, what I was saying, the consistency spec to using Gathering Storms. Now, Gathering Storms, your damage is increased based upon runes spent while Remorseless Winter is up. Now, as for this spec, since you're generally trying to use more Frost Strikes than you are Obliterates, understand that using Murderous Efficiency now actually pumps more base runes into Gathering Storms than, of course, the consistency spec that you're more based on using Frost Strikes. Now, if you use like Frost Scythe also with your consistency spec, you're not going to generate any Howling Blast runes, and each one of those free Howling Blast runes actually goes into Gathering Storms. Now, you're asking me, Now we see that the breath spec at the 2 minute mark does huge amount of damage, a lot more damage than the consistency spec. And your guys' main question is, what happens at, the 5 minute mark? Like, is the consistency spec going to be stronger than the breath spec? And the answer is no, guys. And the reason being is because Frozen Pulse is, of course, both of the specs, kind of upper. It's what keeps both of them from dropping below a certain amount of DPS. And as you know, this spec, since you're just pumping out runes as fast as you can, pushing them into Gathering Storms using Murderous Efficiency, you generally get it all the time. Like, you proc from it all the time. It actually happens to be one of your highest DPS abilities when you're actually proccing it quite a bit. As for the consistency spec, of course, you're not going to set your priority to dumping runes for the most part. So that's where kind of the breath spec overtakes the consistency spec, because the consistency spec is actually moving over to partial Gathering Storms. And according to the stuff I've done and the tests that I've ran, the consistency of breath is actually a bit higher than the consistency spec, which is pretty crazy to see. But that seemed to be most of your concerns. Now, what's going on with the nerf that's going on, as I showed you guys before, the 10% stamina nerf, which means in PvE and PvP it didn't actually state, so it's going to probably happen in both, unless it doesn't affect the PvP template, which I can't imagine it will, because usually when they just have like a blatant statement, 10% nerf, it's going to be both. So 10% stamina is basically equivalent to about roughly about 4,000. If I have 44,000, that would be, yeah, whatever. We'll just take off about, okay, we'll take off our gloves and we'll take off our belt. That's going to be roughly about 4,000 stamina. And that'll be roughly around what our health is. Probably a little bit less than that, to be honest. It's probably about 2350 is where our health is going to be after the 10% stamina nerf. And the reason they're doing this is to nerf our survivability down slightly. And of course, since we're getting such a giant damage nerf to breath, guys, as you can see, they're turning us into crazy little glass cannons. It's going to be interesting to see. Also, what's going to happen is, since we're taking a bit of health nerf, it's also going to be a slight nerf to our healing percentage abilities like Death Strike, which is really our only healing at the moment. So yeah, we're taking a nerf to our health and a slight nerf to, of course, our healing capability, since it is percentage. But as for that, guys, I just wanted to kind of review this for you on 7.1.5, because a lot of people seem to be confused, as my test did show that breath being a lot stronger, of course, within the first 2 minutes and 30 seconds. They're wondering, of course, after that mark, like 5 to 10 minutes, what's going to happen to the DPS. And since they both are based upon the same mechanics for keeping up consistency after the buff to Remorseless Winter, now also remember that Howling Blast is taking a 6% nerf, which is a nerf to the consistency spec. But it's not as big of a nerf to the, of course, breath spec. It is slightly, of course, a nerf to it. But since they are buffing up the breath spec so much, of course, it's making it, like an over buff compared to what they're doing to the consistency spec. But anyways, guys, I wanted to update you on that. If you don't know what's going on with the buffs, what's going on with 7.1.5, go ahead and take a look at the rest of the channel. Of course, I got stuff updated on that and how much damage you're going to do, things like that. Also, in PvP, how much health are we going to have? I forgot to update you on that. We'll probably lose about 450 to 500k with a 10% loss, leaving us with roughly about 27 and 2.7 mil, which is still quite a bit of health. I mean, we won't have like 3.1 mil, which with a healer made us almost impossible to kill, which was pretty fun. But I believe in those situations, in like rated PvP and 3s, our health probably needed to be lower. But are they going to up our healing or something? Are they going to give us a little more percentage in Death Strike? Something like that might be needed. But we'll definitely have to see what they got in mind for us in the future. I definitely am excited to see what they're going to do in 7.1.5, guys. And I hope you're excited about this video. If you guys have any more questions about what's going on with this, what DPS is like, let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, guys, this was your boy Hazzed.
At the edge of the hellfire.